Cornucopia, Pumpkin Pie, Turkey, Afternoon Tea Set, Large Bookshelf, Stepladder, Microscope, Moth Orchid, and Tricycle, and even Shower Stall. And that concludes why I think that Mega Man 2 is the best Mega Man on NES. What is up, guys? So today we are actually doing another versus video. Coming off of yesterday's video looking at Hypno versus Chimeco, I definitely want to try to continue doing these versus videos, maybe on the weekends, just to kind of break some of my content apart a little bit so that it doesn't feel like I'm literally doing the same thing every single day of the week. But this kind of led me to an interesting kind of thing, because knowing that we have psychic types in the Nightmare Cup, I kind of wanted to take a look at two Pokemon that are extremely similar, except they have different movesets. So that led me to look into today's two subjects, which are Slowbro, yes, and Slowking. So just to give you a quick heads up, for like half of this video, I talk about Slowking having Ice Beam. Totally meant to write Blizzard there, so okay. It's definitely, I'm referring to Blizzard whenever I talk about him, but I definitely wrote Ice Beam. Just so that you're aware, Slowking has Blizzard, not Ice Beam. I'm an idiot. Both of these Pokemon have identical base stats. So the first part of this video is going to be the same stats for both Pokemon, and it'll kind of make sense in just a second. So for instance, both Slowbro and Slowking actually end up having a max CP at level 40 with 15s across the board at 25-45. Your IV combination that you want to try to shoot for is a 0-13-15, which will equal 1500 on the dot at level 22.5. This is possible because both Pokemon have the identical stats of a 177 for attack, 180 for defense, and 216 for stamina. So the big deal there is that our attack is our lowest stat, which it's not too much lower than our defense. It's only 3 stat points lower, but it is the lowest, so that is a favorable stat spread for PvP. And we have a huge stamina stat, which is 216. That's big. That's a ton of HP to work with in a lot of scenarios for PvP. So according to my spreadsheets and my numbers, both Slowbro and Slowking are tied for 8th in bulk and 6th in stat product. So they're actually pretty high up there on the board. But here's where it gets really interesting, because both of these Pokemon do have access to Confusion, which is nice. They both have access to Psychic, which is nice. But Slowbro actually ends up having access to Ice Beam, then in turn gets Water Pulse for its third move. So it has Psychic, Ice Beam, and Water Pulse. On the Slowking side, we actually end up having Blizzard instead of Ice Beam, which is just objectively slower. Fire Blast, which is interesting because that means we have a totally different move than Slowbro, which could be potential. And then we also have Psychic. So kind of the big kicker here is, do you want to have a fire move or a water move? And is the ice move even worth it? Well, based on what I've been researching today, here's my findings. So in terms of the perfect moveset, let's actually go over the easier one first. So Slowking, actually his best moveset in terms of just general win percentage is Confusion, Psychic, and not Ice Beam. That's it. That means that his best moveset contains 2 Psychic moves with an Ice type move to boot, which is not too shabby. So this kind of situation ends up leaving us with a very specific role as a specialist. Being that we have 2 Psychic moves really makes it pretty apparent that the Psychic typing is going to resist a lot of our damage. Ice Beam is our only neutral damage move to the pure Psychic typing. Some of the Psychic types will still get hit for super effective, like Xatu for instance, but in general, it's just going to be neutral damage to most. And then Dark types are just gonna wreak havoc on us. I mean, it's gonna suck. And then fighting types make the most sense. That's our easiest target. So we want to target our fighting types, which means if you enjoy using Slowking more, he's definitely a specialist. You definitely want to focus your attention on taking out those fighting types, because literally in a 1 versus 1 shield situation, you beat every one of them except for Gallade. But we'll get into that in just a second. Moving over to Slowbro here. Oh, this guy has some interesting things about him. Because he has access to a water fast move and also a water charge move, it kind of gives us a little room to play. And I'm going to leave the preferred moveset literally up to you guys, because it's insanely close and it's so hard to choose. It literally depends for me on the other components of my team before I even chose a moveset for Slowbro, because these two are so freaking close. So our two options, in my personal opinion, these are the best two options, okay? So Water Gun, Psychic, and Ice Beam versus Confusion, Water Pulse, and Ice Beam instead. So the benefit to having Confusion is that it's Confusion. Everybody knows in the Nightmare Cup, Confusion is big. It's the move to have on a Psychic type. If you don't have Confusion, you're already being knocked down pegs because you don't have one of the best Psychic type moves in the Cup. But having Confusion means that you're going to be resisted whenever you go up against most of these Psychic typings. So that's where Water Gun comes into play. Because Water Gun ends up being our fast move, it means that we're basically doing neutral damage to like almost all of the Cup. We're doing resisted damage to a few of the grass types, and we're doing super effective to some of the fire types, but you're basically neutral to like 90% of the Cup, which is huge. Then on top of that, you have the option as a Psychic type move in your pocket to fire out at those fighting types, or you have the Ice Beam to fire as neutral damage to a lot of the Cup in itself. So, how does this fare for both of our Pokemon? Looking at shields, let's keep the theme going with Slowking first. Our shielding situation ends up being awkward, to say the least, on this side. So 0 versus 0 is our closing type situation when neither me or my opponent have shields. 35.8%. Okay, not too shabby. 2 versus 0, so when I have 2 shields and my opponent doesn't have any shields. 76.1. That's pretty big. That's 3/4 of the Cup that you can basically beat. Now, what do we lose to? That's the important thing here. When I have 2 shields, I want to know what's just going to flat out beat me every day, all day, when I have all the shield advantage. And that's dark types. Almost every single dark type ends up beating our Slowking here. The only Pokemon that we end up having a chance against in the dark typing are things like Houndoom, Alolan Persian is in this list, Cacturne, Crawdaunt, Alolan Muck, and Spiritomb all end up falling to our Slowking whenever we have 2 shields and they don't have any. Our next scenario is actually 0 shields versus 2 shields. So when I don't have any shields and my opponent has all the shield advantage that they could possibly have, we actually end up winning 25.4% of those matches. Well, the only ones that we actually end up winning against, which are the important ones for me here, are the fighting types. Basically, we win against most of the fighting types except for like Gallade and Lucario actually end up beating us. Our next situation is actually a 2 versus 2 situation. So when I have both shields, my opponent has both shields, or a mock-up like opening situation, we actually end up winning 44.8% of those matches, which is not bad, and that actually ends to lead us that we should probably be an opener rather than a closer, considering that statistically we will win more matches as an opener rather than a closer. Kind of goes to show that. So the last situation that I run in our versus videos is actually a 1 versus 1 spread. So a 1 versus 1 spread, I want to know how many Pokemon do we actually end up winning, losing, and tying against. And here we actually end up winning 31.3%, 62.7% are losses, and then 6% are ties. So interesting. Only 31.3%. So we actually do better with 0 shields on both sides rather than giving the opponent even 1 shield. So that kind of goes to show that Slowking really hates whenever the opponent has shields. If you have the option and are planning on using Slowking, definitely look into having Pokemon that are shield busters like crazy. Pokemon that are just so fast at busting shields that your opponent is literally left with no shields, so that you can whip out Slowking and just pound away on their fighting types, because that's really the only use for Slowking. Now let's actually switch over to our more complicated subject of today. We actually have all of our shielding situations, but I ran it with both of our movesets. So of course, this is me trying to relay this information to you guys so that you guys can use it as you see fit. But let's go over these. In a 0 versus 0 shield situation, so as our closing type situation, Water Gun, Psychic, and Ice Beam end up doing 55.2%. Already, you can kind of see we're already doing better. In a 2 versus 0, so again, when I have 2 shields and my opponent doesn't have any, 94%. Which is also already better. In a 0 versus 2, of course that is me having no shields, my opponent having 2 shields, 10.4%. Slowking ends up doing better here. And it's kind of interesting because when we run Water Gun, we don't have as quick of super effective damage towards the fighting types, so we start to dwindle away on some of our wins. When we have a Psychic fast attack, it ends up securing a lot of those matches a lot more easily, rather than having to rely on them not shielding or just always end up shielding our Psychic type damage. So we're gonna have to settle for neutral damage, which just ends up making us lose more on this end. Our next situation is the 2 versus 2, so the lead-off situation here. We actually end up winning 49.3%. Not too shabby. Now comparing that to Slowking, we prefer to open here because we statistically beat more when we open rather than close. But here, we actually prefer to close rather than open. Interesting. Moving on to our 1 versus 1 here. So win, loss, tie. We actually have 32.8 for our wins, 64.2 for our losses, and only 3% are ties. So already, in general, we're a little bit better, but pretty much really close. So not too big of a change. Now let's actually go over our other moveset, being Confusion, Water Pulse, and Ice Beam. So here, we actually end up in a 0 versus 0 situation, 49.3%. So just a tad bit worse than our Water Gun situation. In our 2 versus 0, where I have 2 shields and my opponent doesn't have any, 82.1. So again, just a little bit worse. In our 0 versus 2 shields, so when the opponent has the shield advantage, 25.4, way better. And that, there again, is because we have quicker access to that super effective damage, which helps us overcome those fighting type matchups where we can just really dog on some damage rather than having to try to rely on our charge moves. And lastly, a 2 versus 2, so when we both have shields, or our opening situation, 46.3, so just slightly worse. And as far as our 1v1 here, so 31.3 as our wins, 61.2 as our losses, and 7.5 as our ties. Now, interestingly enough, that's almost the exact same as our 1 versus 1 here. Now let's actually move on to some more narrow, targeted situations to try to figure out how well our 2 subjects actually do up against an entire typing. So for instance, if we talk about Slowking here again, up against the dark types, every single one beats us. That's what that should say. Literally, we actually lose to every single dark type. Pretty crazy. We literally just lose to them all. None of them beat us. Pretty understandable. Psychic type, dark type, we lose. Now up against our Psychics here, when you look at these matchups, the only ones that we actually end up winning are Slowking. So obviously you can gear your Slowking to actually beat other Slowkings, but okay. Drowsy, Spoink, and Wobbuffet are all wins for us. Okay, Drowsy, really low on a stat spread, really mediocre moves. It's just not going to be hitting for a whole lot. Spoink, same situation. Wobbuffet. Now in terms of ties, we actually tie against Espeon, Kadabra, Slowbro, and Smoochum here. So those are kind of starting to get a little faster, but then immediately Jinx, Gallade, Mr. Mime, Girafarig, Alakazam, all the way down until you get to Bronzong and Metagross, which are the most resistant to our damage here, of course, being that they have Steel and Psychic typing. They're going to end up resisting a ton of our psychic damage, but then Hypno, Grumpig, Alolan Raichu, all of those guys start to show up, and those are actually able to do a ton of damage. So when all these guys start to appear, you can really start to tell that Confusion plus Psychic or Blizzard just really isn't fast enough to deal with these guys. They end up having tons and tons of speed compared to us. Alolan Raichu is kind of an outlier because it can actually use electric type moves that end up causing super effective damage to us. Kind of a unique case, but still, he's way faster than us either way. Then whenever we move on to the fighting types, this one's kind of cut and dry. You beat all of them except for Gallade. Gallade makes the most sense as he's going to be able to withstand a ton of our damage due to his unique typing being Psychic and Fighting. And he's got a ton of great moves to go up against a Slowbro or a Slowking, and for that matter. It's got Leaf Blade. For instance, with Gallade, he actually gets 2 Leaf Blade after 3 confusions. What? 3 confusions, he actually gets the Leaf Blade. Plus, Leaf Blade's actually going to be doing super effective damage because we carry a water typing. So we're just kind of screwed. Now, moving on to Slowbro. So here again, I do have both of our movesets separated so we can kind of compare the two to figure out which one works better for you guys. And up against the Darks, basically, if you run Water Gun, you can win against Houndoom. Otherwise, you're going to lose against everything else. If you run Confusion, you just flat out lose to everything else. Water Gun does help you win against Houndoom simply because it does carry a fire typing, so you can kind of do some super effective damage there. But if you're carrying Psychic, you have to rely on Water Pulse, and in a 1 versus 1 shield scenario, Water Pulse, you have to rely on that, and basically they're going to be able to shield it right out of the gate, so you end up just doing nothing. You really, really suck against the Dark types. Psychic typing, though, is a little bit different. So in the Psychic matchups with Water Gun, Psychic, Ice Beam, you die to a lot of the neutral meta. Any Pokemon that has access to a fast move that can be neutral or even super effective to you, you basically die to. Alolan Raichu, Legacy Starmie actually shows up here with Quick Attack. Things like that are just gonna, they're just gonna be able to overwhelm you because you have neutral damage, they have neutral damage. You just kind of start getting overwhelmed with a lot of this neutral damage, and it just ends up letting you die. Now, the only ones that you start to win against whenever it comes to the Psychic ones are either the ones that have Psychic type fast moves that basically just you resist, or they have a neutral move but have really, really slow charge moves. So, that's your only saving grace whenever it comes to the Psychic types. In terms of Confusion with Water Pulse, it's pretty much the same story. Confusion does do a little bit more damage, but it's going to be resisted, so basically you're dying to a lot of the Pokemon that in turn can now output neutral damage to you, and you basically lose to those Pokemon that are really, really slow. With our fighting types here, so Slowbro actually loses to a couple of fighting types whenever you use Water Gun and Psychic. I've been preaching it the entire video. Basically, you have to rely on your charge move, and if they have a shield, they're going to block it, of course. So you're basically just doing neutral damage in return. Most of the fighting types in this cup have counter, so counter just ends up being way better than Water Gun. Water Gun is actually a interesting move, to say the least. So we actually end up losing to things like Breloom, which I'm pretty sure for PvPoke it uses grass type moves because it is preferred against the water typing. Hitmontop, Hitmonchan, Lucario, Heracross, Gallade, Machamp, all these end up just having their day with us. Then we also actually end up winning against a few, like the fire types, and even we actually end up winning against some of the slower ones like Machoke, Machop, Hitmonlee, things of the like. Now as far as Confusion, Water Pulse, and Ice Beam, up against the fighting types, we don't do too bad. We only have a loss to Gallade here. which ends up being pretty nice, and that kind of helps secure, like, it kind of helps secure a role for each one of these movesets. So let's actually go into that. Let's talk about basically the final verdict for these two. Let's go over the easy one first. Slowking, just get rid of it. Just don't use it, okay? Just don't. I don't want to tell you don't use it, but unless Slowbro's like your favorite Pokemon. Now, as far as the more interesting one, definitely Slowbro has some potential here. Now, I like to think of Slowbro as having dual roles. So, depending on which moveset you choose, you can actually build out a pretty nice generalist. So, building with Water Gun, Psychic, and Ice Beam, you actually have a pretty good generalist here, meaning that you actually win. I mean, if you look at these numbers, they're pretty solid. Being that, I mean, 94% whenever you have complete shield advantage is pretty big. Of course, we do actually really like to have our shields because, as you can see, whenever we don't have shield advantage, we do really, really poor. But that's actually a pretty nice generalist role. Whereas if you went with Confusion, Water Pulse, and Ice Beam, it's a little bit more focused towards the fighting types, definitely towards some of the psychic types, not preferably some of them, but it becomes a nice specialist when you use one moveset versus the generalist when you use another. So I definitely think that's the takeaway from this video. Slowking, I mean, you can use him, but Slowbro, on the other hand, definitely does actually have some merit, which he's still not like a for sure pick for me. Like, I definitely don't want to tell you go get a Slowbro like it's the one Pokemon that's going to solve everything. I don't necessarily believe that, but I do believe that if you wanted to use Slowbro as kind of a surprise pick, especially in the rock, paper, scissors type meta that we're in, whenever it comes to the Nightmare Cup, Slowbro has some potential. He's definitely not going to be top tier echelon. He's not going to be like the #1 pick that everybody's going to flock to after they see this video, but he's got some options for sure. So that is actually it for this video, guys. Thank you so much for hanging out. Thank you so much for watching. Of course, I'm sorry that the versus videos run a little long, but there's tons more information to go through rather than the deep dives that we do. If you guys have any ideas on a versus type video that you're wanting to see, definitely let me know down in the comments. These are always really interesting to do. It's always really cool to put two Pokemon head to head to see what their differences are. And it really helps whenever you go to look at two totally similar Pokemon and kind of decide, because before this video, I couldn't have told you which one was better. I mean, yeah, you can look at the moves and you can kind of see it, but I never would have figured out that there's this like inside, like, I mean, I could have done a freaking versus video on these two separate freaking movesets. I mean, I never would have figured that out unless I did this video. So, that's why I do it. If you guys have any interesting Pokemon that you want me to look at, whether it's for a deep dive or for a versus video, please just drop it down below. I'll be happy to add it to the spreadsheet so that I can start working on it whenever I can, because there's a ton of stuff coming up. After all of that, I would really like to know, which moveset do you prefer? Because it's kind of interesting that he just has these two completely awkward movesets that work in tandem in some ways, but definitely have two totally separate roles in my head. But let me know what you guys think about Slowbro and even about Slowking. I don't want to downplay him that much. He is there. But thank you guys so much for hanging out. Thank you so much for watching. And remember, if you like to like videos, make sure you do that. If you don't, you can be that guy. Otherwise, let me know what you have to say down in the comments below. And until our next video, I will catch you then.